Hey, welcome to another Coffee and HEMA episode with me, Jamie McKeever. In my last video, I mean, continuing on talking about fencing styles, fencing systems. In my last video, I was talking about how important systems are and how some books are more obvious than others in terms of being able to draw out what's the underlying principles, what are the underlying concepts that kind of sit beneath it, rather. Sorry. And I promised to talk about how to kind of draw these out from different sources. Which I talk about in general terms, but it is unfortunately quite different depending on the source that you're working with. And the broad version is that a lot of fencing texts that we have, some are quite explicit about the principles that sit underneath it. Some of those principles are quite opaque. It keeps you think of, for me at least, distressor ways of describing things just fucking roll off my brain. And sometimes they are just completely just non-obvious from looking at the source. Good examples of ones where this is a problem. Fiore de Libri is one where I think there's a lot of good underlying principles that aren't very explicit. And some are, Distressor has lots of explicit principles that are quite confusing. Dall'Agocchio was the one that I had the most recent experience with, where he starts off well. He starts off describing kind of common principles about tempo and this kind of stuff. And then he goes into these very long sequences of actions that don't really have any obvious underlying organizing principle. And it's particularly where texts have a lot of plays, right, but not necessarily much discussion of when to apply them, or patterns that look like an assault. So assault is a sequence of actions that you see in the Bolognese that are kind of solo exercises. Dall'Agocchio's version of this is that he basically gives you a series of attacks and defenses and responses, and anything where it's going into like listing actions or describing actions in detail tends to fall from these issues of basically preventing you from looking for the wood for the trees. So to use Dall'Agocchio as the example, because as I say, it's the one that's freshest in my mind, what did I do there? Well, I started going through these lists of actions, and the first thing you need to do is start putting a tactical lens on whatever action is being described, to understand like when would it come up, because that's often what's missing from these things. When does this thing apply? When does this come up? Beyond that, though, you also need to start making connections between the actions, right? And the tactical lens is a very good way of doing this, because you can understand different techniques as they appear in different places, and like what is the tactical lens that supports that to use to then say, okay, well, these actions are similar. In Dall'Agocchio's case, he was talking about this kind of attack, and he was listing out actions by going from he describes it as you're in this guard, they attack you this way, you make this defense, so you do this follow up. And then he goes through every single possible follow-up, every single possible defense, every single possible guard, and it's very confusing. So the question for Dall'Agocchio was, is the guard the tactical construction, or is the attack? And he basically starts with the guard, and I said, no, actually it's the attack. The attack is the tactical situation, not the guard. So instead of going through his way of doing it, which ended up with like 200 combinations or something like that, I structured around, okay, this is the attack is the framework. What does he say against this attack from this guard, from this guard, from this guard, from this guard? And it reduced the process from a really convoluted 100 actions you'll never remember to about 7 or 8 different things that are all kind of similar and apply in different situations. So here we've now gone from a list of actions to actually a very simple tactical system, which is that things like someone's attacking you at the head, one of your options is to come to the head guard. Straightforward. And this is my favorite one, but the rest of them are all pretty obvious too. And then once you've mapped them to tactical systems, then the next step is to try and map actions to similar actions in other tactical contexts and understand what the differences are. It could be the same action applied to multiple times. Dall'Agocchio has got another great example of this, which is half cuts, right? He uses a half cut, which is really just a cut point to a point forward position. He uses that as a defense against thrusts and rising strikes. He uses that as a provocation to make an opening, and he uses it, of course, as a cut, right, as a single tempo defense to the cut to the hand. And we've now got a sort of a central system component because we can see that this same pattern is repeating across different areas too. Other systems, unfortunately, other books, really, I should say, won't necessarily have the same things you can do. Right? Ultimately, what you need to do is when you've got this big list of actions, what you're trying to do is, as a general rule, is make connections between them. to understand which of them are similar, which of them apply in similar or the same tactical situations, and if there are multiple things for the same tactical situations, why, right? What is the consequence? Is it because one is slightly better if you're a bit further away, or is it because one sets up a different kind of counterattack that follows from it, right? And you need to really kind of build through all these sorts of things, and all of this is very hard, I should say, right? Plays are another example. I like to group plays together. So when I teach plays, I will teach I'll teach things that always work if you're crossing is on the left, right? Or I might teach things to do with similar kinds of actions that you do. So all the players that are grabbing with one hand, all the players that are half swording, all the players that are doing any of the other sort of specific styles of technique in Vardy and Martoki or Dadagokia. And by building those connections, A, it'll help you in your class planning. B, it'll help you get this conception of the system as a whole by understanding the components and how they fit together. And it'll be much easier to apply it in fencing because you're not trying to go through this kind of set of hundreds of actions as it goes through. The downside is it is much, much harder, right? It's a lot more work. You're not going to be able to pick up a book and immediately say, aha, now I have this. This is it, right? And developing this for Vardy took me years. Developing it for Dadagokia took me months. I was a bit better at it, and I think it was a bit easier with Dadagokia, to be fair, than it was for Vardy. But it's not a sit down and read the book and you're done. You're going to be going back and forth. You're going to be scribbling on the book. You're going to be writing notes in a document. Some of them will be wrong. You're going to be playing about with it with friends, right? And seeing, does this work or does this not work? And building it through there. But it's worth the effort, right? And unfortunately, if I had a time machine, I'd go back in time. But if I could only send someone else back in time, what I would do is I would send editors to every single historical fencing master because they were all desperately in need of them. There's ideas in there. They're great ideas. They are by and large poorly expressed, not just because translation and the shifting of time, but actually, written books as a common medium were pretty new in the day and age that most fencing masters were writing. I mean, writing things down, yes, but they weren't the sort of the day-to-day thing that we would have from modern day kind of being able to go down a thing and buy a book. The average Waterstones has a bookshop in the UK, if you don't know, it has more books in it than the Library of Alexandria probably did. And they're bad at it as a result. It's a relatively new thing. So you won't really get to the bottom of what were they trying to tell you if you just try and tackle it, at face value in the book. So all in all, hopefully those are some ideas that were helpful. Could have been more coherent. But fundamentally, as I say, the main thing is don't just read a book, read a fencing text, assume that all the ideas are given to you on a plate. You need to put some work in to understand the connections between them, to decide what is relevant, to decide when things should be applied. And that's what you should be teaching to rather than the core book. Thanks for watching.